We'll
All
do
right.
it live.
Yeah, we'll do it live. Welcome to another edition of the Oh Bro Show. I am your host for tonight, Josh, and I'm joined by my other host, Seth.
Yep.
Seth, it's been not really that long. We're consistent, so
we're getting there.
yeah,
We're
we're consistent.
Stream.
Some new lights, so we have 2 lights.
Yep.
And I hung up another thing. So
Look at that production value.
Yeah, it's increasing. Hey, we have an exciting episode today because we're not just joined by one person and Seth. We're joined by 2 people, 2 creators, 2 people that are going to talk theology, specifically of the Reformed persuasion with us, Seth. So I'm excited. This is going to be our first kind of panel discussion that we're doing here on the Obro Show, and we'll see how we do. We're going to learn a lot. We're going to talk Calvinism. We're going to talk probably Arminianism. We're probably going to talk about bad examples of Calvinism.
Yep. Probably lots of that.
Yeah. Probably all sorts of stuff.
It's going to be the first time that we have more than just one qualified person on the stream.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's going to be great.
Yeah. And so we're good. Hey, I do want to put it out there for the Ober Show. If you're watching, tuning in to the video on demand on the channel, the Ober Show. I'm Seth. I'm announcing this for the first time. Our goal is 250 subscribers by the new year. Okay, so that's our goal. So help us get there. Tell your friends. Tell your family. Tell your mom, your dad, your child, whoever it is, to subscribe to the Obro Show. Seth, why should they subscribe?
It's free.
Okay, there you go.
Why not?
There you go. Yeah, it's easy as that. Okay, let me bring up our guest for tonight, and then we'll get into the conversation, which I'm super excited for. So welcome to the stage, Protestant Perspective, and Miles and Canon Creed. Hello, welcome, Oz and Miles.
Thank you.
Little clap.
Little clap.
Hey, I don't know if I should do any preliminary things. So
Gonna jump into it.
just jump right into it. Why did you guys get into, just give me a little bit of the backstory. Why did you guys start making content? Why did you start talking about Reformed theology? Why did you do any of this online? Why are you here today?
Go for it, Oz.
Yeah. Well, I didn't plan on getting into it, but I felt like there was a time where I struggled with a lot of my Reformed views, specifically like on when it comes to God and the relation to sin, predestination, stuff like that. A lot of the critiques I was struggling with the adequate answers. Then I ended up reading a lot of like Puritans and early modern Reformed theologians, and I was blown away by the robust nature of their answers and how they reconciled the full counsel of God. And it made me realize, like, man, there's really a lot of bad answers to these questions from Calvinists on YouTube and on Google stuff you look up, and it's very different from what you get from actually reading the primary sources. So I just decided to make a Twitter and post quotes that I found that I thought clarified a lot of the views, and then I ended up just making a YouTube. So the Protestant Perspective name may not be the most accurate to what I do. It might give off like Protestant Apologetics, which I don't do. I mostly just stick to the Reformed tradition, and especially on topics that I find interesting. But that's basically why I got into it. I wanted to help people that may have wrestled with the same questions I had and show them that the Reformed do have good answers to these. And yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah, I wasn't planning on doing anything on YouTube, and I've been on YouTube now for 4 years. Just not Canon and Creed is not 4 years old. Canon and Creed is only 4 months old, 3 or 4 months old. But I was making content. A lot of people don't know this, on a different channel. So I was doing Contra Seventh-day Adventist apologetics, which is a very, a sort of micro niche, if you will. And there's a long backstory to that I've given over on that channel. So if people want to know about that, I talked a little bit about it with Javier Perdomo. Actually, the video went up today. It's over on his channel. People can check that out. But I've also done that over on the Answering Adventism channel. But despite that, I obviously have interest theologically outside of cultic theology, we'll say. And so because that's the case, I'm obviously dabbling in all sorts of theological matters, and I have been for quite some time. So in the background of doing Answering Adventism, I kept just having this itching bug of why are people not, and by people, I mean Protestants, evangelicals, people widely in that stream, why are they not very familiar with like what's actually been handed down in their own traditions? And there's just a lot of reasons. And so I kind of ruminate on stuff like that. And I really saw a need to bring that to people in a digestible way, because the reality is most people are not going to pick up the books. They're not going to do the digging. And so I tried to figure out what's a solution and a way to essentially solve that problem and make it more accessible to people. So I don't really fancy myself as like an apologist. I know that that kind of just comes with the territory, but just in terms of my own frame of reference, I really just view myself as like a video essayist, if you will, just kind of presenting this information, take it or leave it. And a part of the reason why too is because I've never really wanted to have the sort of the moniker of like a pastor, because I'm not. And I take those sort of things like super serious. And so I try not to take on this sort of authoritative teaching role. Now, again, I know that that kind of necessarily comes with presenting information, but just in terms of kind of my own frame of reference, Canon and Creed's goal really is inward facing to Protestants. So I saw people out there, there needs to be more of this. People doing rhetoric, externally facing, contra Roman Catholic apologetics, contra Orthodox apologetics, etc. But there weren't a lot of people that were doing inward facing apologetics, speaking to our own side of the aisle and getting the average pew sitter caught up to speed. So that's really what Canon and Creed is ultimately about. And that's basically why I started this specific channel.
Yeah, really interesting. You guys kind of both identified needs in your own way, and bad answers and things to fill. So why did you guys both land in the Reformed tradition? And that might go earlier than even this, but why are you Reformed?
Well, one thing I will say, and Oz, I'll let you go first since I just got done rambling. But I guess one other thing too is that Canon and Creed really isn't. Canon and Creed is very pan-Protestant, I should say. I'm very big actually on like Protestant Catholicity, if you will. And you get that vibe from the videos in the sense of I'm constantly citing citations just across the gamut. And so just as an FYI for audience people, I do obviously identify as Reformed, or I wouldn't be here talking about that. But the focus of the channel is not necessarily just Reformed theology. But Oz, give your answer on why you are Reformed.
Yeah, I saw that one of the commenters, my buddy Firebat, said that Oz landed in the Reformed tradition via his mother's consumption of Tylenol while pregnant. So I think it's probably true.
Crazy.
Yeah. No, it was weird. So I started. I was saved at a Baptist church. It was a Spanish-speaking Baptist church. So that was just kind of like the default view. It was like just regular Baptist, not a particular Baptist, but just kind of more Southern Baptist-y, if you can call it that, but in California. And I ended up, I kind of held to, when I would read scripture, when it came to like eschatology, I struggled with the dispensationalism that was taught there, especially with like, as far as Israel is concerned. When I would read, Romans or Galatians, or just throughout, it seemed to me that it was clear that those who have faith are the true Israel. So it's kind of started there, and then obviously I had a stage cage buddy who challenged me on my my views on soteriology, and I wanted to prove him wrong. So I started trying to look up how to refute what he was telling me was Calvinism, and eventually I ended up being convinced of the view. And then after that, I started exploring other views. Like, okay, dang, a lot of these things I haven't really thought through. So, I started. Then it moved on to baptism, the sacrament, basically the Eucharist and baptism. And I ended up just affirming Reformed views, and that's essentially how I ended up there. I just thought they were biblical, they made sense, and yeah, now I'm in a PCA church. Before I was at Calvary Chapel. After I left my Baptist church because it was Spanish speaking, I went to a non-denominational church, and from there I went to Calvary. Then from Calvary, now I'm in the PCA, and I've been loving it. And yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
It definitely does. Yeah.
Well, there is a lot I could say, but I will start by saying, Oz, I'm glad you didn't make the necessary predestination joke. I'm reformed because I was predestined to be reformed. But with a question like this, I like to preface by saying that first and foremost, I identify as Christian, then Catholic, lowercase c, then Reformed, and then Protestant. And I don't say all of that to try and be cute or verbose or like a contrarian or anything like that, but because that's my own self-perception. Like Catholic in continuity, but Reformed by conviction, which is why I've said on my channel that I think we should retrieve the language of like Reformed Catholic, if you will. So I identify with Reformed Catholicity first and foremost, because I believe it presents the most faithful systematic exposition and representation of Scripture. Not because I think the Westminster Standards are inspired or inerrant, containing a type of, like divine charism, but because I believe they do faithfully expound upon what the Scriptures do indeed teach, despite being formulated by sinful humans. Secondly, and this wouldn't be something that I'd give as like an external evidence to be reformed or something like that, but since the question is about me, my own experience of God saving me, it was in such a, I would say, tangible way that really aligns with what God says the marks of such a thing are. Like Romans 10, faith comes by hearing, excuse me, like hearing the word of God, the Spirit sovereignly working with that word to basically enact the miracle of regeneration. And the Reformed obviously heavily emphasize that. And so that was my own lived experience that just so happened to align with what I would later learn is basically like a Reformed understanding of soteriology. Now, what's funny about that is I went through a very vehement provisionist anti-Reformed period, where I was very rabidly anti-Reform. Now, to be fair, this is pretty early on in my walk. I was very zealous, and the Lord has a way of just humbling you, obviously, over time. And so I've calmed down a lot compared to where I was there. But yes, I was a very vehement anti-Reformed type of individual, despite having this, experience and encounter with Christ. And that just kind of over time, as I'm analyzing that more, obviously, and I'm studying theology now and kind of getting the bearings on various things, I'm starting to realize that there's kind of a story there I could talk about regarding reading some Luther and those types of things. But the point being is I came to realize that basically my own experience actually aligns with what the Reformed teaching of God's working in salvation looks like. And it had a very tangible sort of effect on me in a way that's just really kind of hard to shake. There's a lot of things we talk about that are maybe philosophical in nature, even theological in nature. And I don't put a ton of stock in like personal experience, like I said, as some sort of like divine arbiter or anything like that. But I do think that there is a real reality to the fact that God does work in people's lives. And so that just in like a really tangible way has really kind of solidified me in the Reformed tradition in like a very unique way, I guess you could say, beyond even just the theology. So there's kind of a lot at play there. But thirdly, I'm also pretty theologically autistic. And it just so happens that basically that's what like the Reformed tradition is filled with. And I only say that somewhat jokingly. I am really blown away though by like the all-encompassing nature of the Reformed system and the seriousness with which it takes like all areas of theology, and just the extremely high view of Scripture. And then fourthly, doctrinally, I'm convinced of the Reformed doctrine of the Sabbath. As well as like the objective, real spiritual presence of the Eucharist, presbyterial governance, and presbyterial succession. Though I do have to admit, I am sympathetic towards like James Ussher's like Reformed episcopacy. But anyways, that's kind of like a flyover level.
It's really good. Yeah. since you guys have gotten into it, what is your assessment of the Calvinism dialogue or the Reformed?
We're jumping in there right now.
Well,
Yeah.
I just want to just before we even drill into it more, just kind of get real quick, like, what do you guys think? How are Reformed thought of online? Is it more negative? Is it more positive? Is it what are your guys' assessments of the dialogues at?
I think it depends on the pockets you're in. Because the thing that's hard with the internet is like you get a custom curated feed algorithmically that can really warp your perspective of just how dominant a topic or an idea actually is out there. And so I think a lot of that happens online, and that becomes a person's reality, because I've lurked around and engaged in so many pockets on various places theologically, forum boards to Facebook to YouTube, all these various places, and it just depends on the pockets you run around in. But I would say the most vocal stuff that you hear is typically negative stuff. It is contra, what people understand to be Reformed theology and its various, misguided flavors out there, if you will. So I think it's a mixed bag, but I think the reason that the loudest of the voices is you don't really have a lot of people in other traditions that are like, yeah, I don't really agree with it, but I understand it. Cool stuff. There's really not a lot of that. It's typically like they believe in this maniacal, crazy idea of a bloodthirsty monster god. These types of things. And so that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, and the algorithms are designed that way to highlight those extreme, the posts with the most interactions. I think all of us are on X are the more inflammatory posts are the ones that get the most interactions, which is unfortunate. So it's hard to gauge because those are the ones that are seen the most. But based on my personal experience, I think as far as the Reformed, I think a lot of them have. There was a period, I think, during the young restless Reformed era where there's a lot of arrogance and rudeness and this just intellectual superiority that Calvinists had, just due to the zeal of finding this new view. You just get that with anything, right? Like for me, my cage stage right now, like I'm in the cage stage with when it comes to some of this stuff that I'm learning, but I try to keep a level head. But anyway, I think that it was more prevalent then, and I think people are transcending the cage stage and becoming more sage stage. So at least from my experience, it seems a lot of people are mellowing out and not being so rude and arrogant. They're being more Christ-like and showing more grace. But you still have knuckleheads who aren't the best and still have that arrogance and rudeness and treat especially Reformed soteriology as like a club or something to beat their theological opponents over the head with, and that's unfortunate. But I think overall, I think it seems to be getting better. I don't know, at least from the circles that I'm in.
Do you think that a lot of that extreme negativity that you guys see online in certain pockets is from a straw man version of Reformed theology, or do you think it's people correctly understanding Reformed theology but just vehemently disagreeing with it?
And we can kind of get into some of the misconceptions there too. With Calvin to answer this as well. What are some of the common misconceptions that maybe these people are attacking?
Yeah, we can do that. I was just going to say that I think it's like hit and miss. Again, I think it depends on the pockets you're running around in, because Reformed theology, a lot of people in this kind of, well, if we're just going to get into, some of the most common misconceptions, this is actually the first one that I had jotted down. I just don't really see this discussed as much either. But there's a misconception that the Reformed tradition is a lot less or a lot more narrow than it actually is. So the inverse being, a lot of people don't have a proper understanding that the Reformed tradition is actually very broad. they confuse like
Hmm.
we get confused with like Calvinism versus Reformed theology, where Calvinism is colloquially typically referring to like the soteriology of Reformed theology.
Mhm.
But that
Yeah.
but Calvinism gets used as just this blanket broad term now, as like oftentimes a very negative thing, where it's just associated with like the tulip, which is like, well,
Mhm.
that's I would argue you can't even really properly. I reject the tulip, by the way, just in terms of that anachronism. I have Lorraine Botner's book, right here. This is the book that it comes from. Like, I reject that analogy. I think it's done more harm than it has good. I understand the idea behind it, but it's like caused serious misconceptions about what Reformed theology actually even is, and that it's a lot more than like a soteriology system or soteriological framework. And so I think it depends what topic we're talking about, because I think certain topics are misrepresented more than or worse than others. And so I would then argue as well that just a lot of Reformed theology is just, you never see really anybody even discuss any aspect of it. When's the last time you saw anybody talking about, again, the Reformed view of the Sabbath? I mean, like when's the last time anybody's talking about the Sabbath? Well, I am. I'm like the only person out there this time, but you don't see anybody faulting Reformed theology for their Sabbath theology. Now I get it because I have Seventh-day Adventists that come at me because they're a Seventh-day Sabbatarian group. But nevertheless, outside of these like really niche things, the average person's not even going to understand or know that's even a key component of the Reformed understanding of the law and the Decalogue and the third use of the law and what the Lord's Day is, and these discussions of like, should church happen exclusively on a Wednesday? Do we have the freedom to do that? These sorts of things. Well, the Reformed tradition has tons of stuff. I mean, just tons of information on this, but no one's out there talking about or really critiquing that. They wouldn't even be able to tell you 9 times out of 10 whether or not that's distinctively Reformed or not Reformed, because all they know is the tulip. That's Reformed theology, etc. So that'd be the first one. I have 5 on my list. Oz and I talked about these earlier, so I'll let him add anything he wants to that. But my first one there just being, I think that a lot of people, I would just recommend folks read more than like John Calvin and R.C. Sproul. Like read Herman Whitzius and like John Davenant. Just branch out and kind of see what else is out there, and you'll see what I mean. But Oz, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you said. I did a video with a couple buddies on tulip and the problems of tulip. Richard Muller's written on it. Cinema talks about it too in his recent book on the Synod of Dort. So yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. To answer the specific question that Seth had, whether the people that are vocalizing against Reformed thought, specifically on soteriology, if it's due to misrepresentations, I think a lot of it is for sure, but they're vindicated because a lot of even Calvinists, and unfortunately, I think it's probably the majority of self-proclaimed Calvinists, also don't understand what their own tradition teaches. They just kind of have like a basic, some decent understanding, or sometimes it's just like wrong, and so they get vindicated when they hear people just echoing what they're saying, what their misrepresentations are. And also, I think sometimes, to be fair to the anti-Calvinists that are very vocal against us because of what they hear other Calvinists say, like some of it is pretty valid. If someone is out like not that recent, but there was a while ago where there was like one person saying that men are sinful in their, like, God created men sinful in our essence, our being is sinful. And when you hear stuff like that and they're Calvinists saying this, and they're anyone that's actually studied in Reformed thought or just Augustinian thought would know that something like that is heretical, even in our view. So to be fair to the anti-Calvinists, some of their critiques against Calvinism is like valid. Like there should be some sort of like someone out there saying God's the author of sin, like, yeah, you should be turned off by those type of statements, right? But that's not, those are misrepresentations of our view. So to your question is yes, and some of it is due to valid concerns about what are the implications of our views. though we reject those implications.
Well, and that kind of gets into like even the second thing on the list, which is that a major one, you're going to see this all the time. I'd argue this is probably one of the most popular ones, is that God determines all things such that every micro motion, thought, and event is pre-planned, and reality is just like a program machine with God as the developer. Now, it may not be verbatim, said like that, but I think we've all heard the objections that would fit into this thinking. It's just the logical conclusion of Reformed theology. You have to believe fatalism, these types of things.
Mhm.
And I sympathize with the people that think this, because later Reformed theologians, or people who identified within the Reformed tradition, have said things that can sound like what they're saying. And some maybe are, like Oz pointed to, random Joe Schmo people out there who just don't know what they're talking about. Yep. I'm annoyed by the kooky cousins of the movement too. So, we're willing to recognize that, yes, they're out there, and they tend to, unfortunately, be the loudest sometimes. But it's important to remember that individual theologians as well are not like a sort of Reformed Pope. Like, I don't care if it's R.C. Sproul, John Calvin, whoever. That's why our tradition has standards for a reason. And you mentioned, Oz, Richard Muller earlier in his great book on divine will and human choice. He has something that he says on this that's a perfect thing that I'm like, this is exactly practical. I've experienced this personally, probably thousands of times at this point. He says, quote, "Not a few of the proponents and critics," so notice, both proponents and critics of the Reformed doctrine of free choice and divine willing, have confused the specifically soteriological determination of the Reformed doctrine of predestination with a divine determinism of all human actions, presumably including such actions as buttering one's toast in the morning, or taking what Jeremy Bentham once called, and now he just uses a really fancy way to say that same thing, an anteprandial circumgyration of his garden. So, close quote. So regardless of one's, the varying opinions out there of Saint Richard Muller, his point here is verifiable by just talking to 10 people, both Reformed and not. It's almost guaranteed that you're going to get people confusing soteriological predestination with a sort of divine determining of every human action at this like really microcosmic level. This is what the Calvinism teaches we're robots, crowd. That whole objection is predicated upon that idea. But it's simply not what the standards confess. And whether one agrees with them or not, I think we should always seek to at least understand what we disagree with, not just externally, but also internally on its own terms. And if we understand the way the terms are being used within the framework that we're examining, we'll see that that's actually not what the Reformed are confessing. And there are a number of Reformed divines that we could look at on this who are within confessional bounds, which I don't want to get into all that now because we're kind of trying to keep it a little bit chill. But there's a number of Reformed divines that explain this, that if you just listen to what they're saying, even if you disagree, you can still at least walk away saying, oh, okay, I better understand it now. And I've been having a lot more people do that as like I said, I don't only put out content on Reformed theology, but periodically I do stuff that's exclusively on Reformed theology. And I've had a number of people who reach out and say exactly that, hey, I don't necessarily agree, but I actually I'm starting to understand it a lot better now. So thank you. Anyways, Oz, your thoughts on that misunderstanding?
Yeah, I think so. What happens here too, that it's a little tricky because within the Reformed tradition, there's diversity of thought within when it comes to what Miles talking about, free will, providence, and how that interacts. Muller is really good on this, and he talked about how with Edwards there was a departure from the Reformed Orthodox thought on free will. So that's why you have a lot of guys taking a more deterministic view. Good books, like just to recommend if people want to read more on this, because it can get very in the weeds and very complicated. But his book, Divine Will and Human Choice, I think it was called Divine Will and Human. Divine Will and Human Choice by Richard Muller. Providence, Freedom, and the Will in Early Modern Reformed Theology by Richard Muller is also good. Yeah, I mean, another quote is, this is from his Providence, Freedom, and the Will. It was never the Reformed view that the moral acts of human beings are predetermined any more than it was ever the Reformed view that the fall of Adam was willed by God to the exclusion of Adam's free choice of sin. So a lot of the critiques against Calvinism has to do with God decreeing all that comes to pass and what that entails. And I think if people understood more what the decree is, what does God mean by what is it? What do the divines mean when they say God ordains all that comes to pass?
Mm-hmm.
If you look right after that, I think they tend to think that they're being what's the word? Dumb, I guess, and contradicting themselves, because after that it says that yet God's not the author of sin, and that liberty is not taken away and contingency is not taken away, but rather established. They think that that's just they just contradicted themselves there, or they're hand waving away the problem. But what they're doing is they're setting up guardrails to explain what that ordination means. So God ordains all that comes to pass, and that ordination is not an ordination that makes God the author of sin, and one that doesn't destroy liberty or contingency. So any type of view of ordination that would make God the author of sin, or strip man of his liberty, or get rid of contingency, that would be an ordination that the Reformed, or the confession, would take issues with. I know that could get very complicated, but I guess for the sake of this video, we won't get too into it. But yeah, that being said, so there's two trains of thought within that view. You have the determinists, which Mueller says that they're a departure from Reformed Orthodox thought, but I think that's the majority view these days, is a deterministic view within a lot of the Reformed, or compatibilism, which is basically determinism. And then you have a more, I don't want to say libertarian free will, because I don't think, kind of Mueller's point is that libertarian free will and determinism or compatibilism are kind of anachronistic. So it's probably not best to categorize them in either one. But anyway, I'm rambling now. I think those books by Mueller are good. There's also Reformed Thought on Freedom that you guys should check it out. That one's not by Mueller. I forget who that's by. I think it's Van Asselt or some guys in that school. But those are good books to check out if you want to learn more about the Reformed. They give actual citations and primary sources, so it's really good stuff.
Yeah, Oz, another big one, and I know you and I are both passionate about this one, is that it isn't hardwired into Reformed theology that one has to hold to a strictly limited John Owenist view of the atonement. As I've shown on my channel, modern scholarship, such as J.V. Fesco, recognize that the standards have room for both the English hypothetical universalist position of folks like John Davenant and Richard Baxter, and the more strict limited view of Owen and Perkins, etc. In fact, in that book, J.V. Fesco says, quote, "While hypothetical universalists may be scarce in 21st century Reformed theology, they were common in the early modern period. This chapter will show that the Westminster Standards are committed to the historic doctrine of Christ enunciated by the ecumenical councils, that Christ holds the threefold office of prophet, priest, and king, and that the confession was written in such a way as to accommodate and allow hypothetical universalism, while at the same time denying remonstrant views on the extent of Christ's satisfaction." Close quote. So I get very agitated at the people out there who balk at this, or try and act like this is some encroachment upon the Reformed tradition, or it's like soft peddling Arminianism. It's like, no, you just don't know what you're talking about. And so again, this is just another area where you get critics obviously from the outside, but you also have it on the inside with this one too. And it seems like a lot of people on the inside that are critical of it, they also misunderstand it, because that's what kept me from embracing this view for such a long time, was because a lot of these gatekeepers trying to say Reformed theology is one thing when no, you're a departure actually from what was actually believed, historically speaking, by a large number of people. Now, I agree that their position was around too, so I'm not dogging that, but we're not the ones saying that your position's completely outside of the confessional bounds or it's some encroachment here and there. I do think it's an evolution. I think that it has a level of development to a degree, but they're kind of like oftentimes trying to act like we have some like soft pedaled view or whatever, when it's like, well, actually no, because I learned this by going back to these early modern Reformed theologians, and they were all saying this, showing that it's not the case that this hard, limited stuff and these, in my opinion, it's just, again, I know that some Reformed people will get offended by this, but so be it. These convoluted mental gymnastics, when we're supposed to believe that the clear parts of Scripture are, perspicuous, that like you just get in my opinion, in some of these texts where it's like, why do we have to do the mental gymnastics to try and make it not say what it says? It says he died for all. So figure out how your theology needs to mold with this instead of these silly defenses that I get. And I have all the books. So like I went through that whole period, but I just started to struggle with that to where it was like, it became very frustrating that this is actually something that has a rich heritage within the tradition. It has better arguments, and it eliminates a huge stopgap for a lot of people who don't want to embrace Reformed theology because they're convinced the only view is this very strict, hard. And again, they oftentimes have a misunderstanding of it. I admit, I've got Owen's commentary set on Hebrews on the shelf. I cite it all the time. People know on Answering Adventism, if they end up watching this, they'll know I'm a huge John Owen guy when it comes to his exegetical commentaries. The book of Hebrews is all about the atonement. So I appreciate Owen. I understand the view. I understand the position. And yes, there's a lot of misrepresentations of it out there too, but there's a lot of people in that crowd as well that actually misrepresent the other side. And there needs to be more people that pick up the megaphone and start saying that sort of thing. But anyways, I was trying not to go on like a run here. Oz, anything that you want to add?
Obviously
just to quickly, before you add odds, just to define terms too, so it's helpful. The two views you're talking about, it's a restricted view of the atonement, limited atonement, and the hypothetical universalism. Can you guys define those terms so it's helpful just to show for clarity in the audience what these two perspectives are and what you guys are talking to in this as well?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Go for it, Oz.
Yeah, I mean, put it simply, the strict particulars view, which is limited atonement, is that Christ died for the sins of the elect alone. The hypothetical universalist view is that Christ died for the sins of all men, but especially for the elect, because he effectually dies for the elect so that they can come to faith and be saved. But yeah, that's basically the simplest I can make it.
Well, and the key difference between
is that
the
I'm
key
sorry, I was
difference
just gonna say,
between
is that different?
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Miles. Is that
you're
different than like the accusation that that's just 4-point Calvinism or whatever? Or is that not even related?
Yes, that gets into a whole
the Amyraldian charge, the charge of being an Amyraldian, which again is hilarious because it's like,
I wasn't even gonna go there. It's just when they say 4-pointer, it's like, what are you using as the standard of points? Is it TULIP? Because if it's TULIP, TULIP is a 20th century acronym. And so I think that's problematic because, like I said, since TULIP is a 20th century acronym, then it's not, I don't think that's the standard by which we should go by. So TULIP itself is supposed to be a summary of Dort. If for those who don't know what Dort is, it's the Reformed churches got together in the 17th century to defend against the remonstrance and come together and make a consensus document. Without getting into all the history, basically, there was two camps within the synod. You had some who, like John Davenant in the British delegation, who held to the view that Christ died for all men, but especially for the elect. And then you had the majority view, which was that Christ died only for the elect. And they ended up writing the document, the Canons of Dort, in a way that both the limitarians and the moderates could affirm the document in good faith. And so since if that's the standard, if TULIP is an acronym that's supposed to be a summary of DORT, and DORT allows for the hypothetical universalist view, then by that standard, we're 5-point Calvinists as well, because we affirm all that's in the canons of Dort, whether some people want to claim it or not. I mean, historically, it's undeniable. Dr. Michael Lynch has done great work documenting this, and others as well. Daniel Hyde, too, in his book, Grace Worth Fighting For. So if the standard is TULIP, then yeah, I guess we're 4-pointers. But if the standard is our actual confession, the canons of Dort, then we are 5-pointers.
Yeah, and I think one thing too, just to answer the question about like people thinking about what's the difference between the two views, really you have to look at the intent of the atonement. So the hypothetical universalist view has like a twofold intent understanding of the atonement. And that's really like a big, I don't want to rabbit trail off on all that, but that is one of the big linchpins that if a person's going to go study this, that would be my recommendation, is to study and read, specifically like Oz mentioned, John Davenant's book on this that Michael Lynch translated, is a phenomenal book. Yeah. And so that's the flip side of the Owen position. So he deals with a lot of Owen's arguments, because a lot of Owen's arguments are what kept me in that frame of reference for a while, until I was later exposed, like I said, to some of these other people. But then when I came across Davenant on this, he points out a number of things that I would argue that the hard limited side is just missing, and that when you understand, the hypothetical universalist position comes out on top. But anyways, I just wanted to mention that. Another big one, Oz, is people misunderstanding double predestination and confusing it with equal ultimacy, where people will use this sort of like doomed from the womb language. But this is often presented. Yeah. And this is often presented in such a way by critics. But so I know Calvin uses that language, but the thing is what people mean by that or think he means by that is oftentimes not what he meant by that. Now, we can get into opinions around Calvin, but it's often presented in such a way by critics as if God kind of like arbitrarily hates people before they've done anything, and then like actively forces them into damnation with no relation to like his justice, which is just misguided. It is true that we affirm both election and reprobation. I really see no way of getting out of this if we take scripture seriously. But the question then becomes, what is meant by those terms more specifically? So Reformed theology does not posit that God creates some people for hell in the same way he creates the elect for glory. Damnation is always understood under the Reformed banner because of sin. And that's the key. It's not like an arbitrary divine hatred. The language of the confessions is actually very careful on this. Oz mentioned it earlier, but it will use phrases like God passes by or withholds mercy, etc. And like mercy can't be demanded when you understand what mercy actually is. So it uses language like that. Now, Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 3, does indeed say that God ordains whatsoever comes to pass, which naturally leads to someone asking, well, that would include sin. So doesn't that make God the author of sin in Reformed theology? Well, one, what Oz said earlier, the confession makes a very clear, careful, statement on this, that if that is what you understand it to be saying or what you believe, you have a heretical view. So no, the confession is careful here. It's important that you know what is essentially meant by the confession, again, even if a person disagrees. But the canons of Dort that he mentioned earlier, canons of Dort 1.5, they also cover this. But the idea is that God's decree includes both permission and sovereign ordering of sinful events, or acts, rather. But the moral blame is entirely the creature's. So if one doesn't understand this, they're going to come away confused by the confession and the system. That's very important for people to understand. God's decree includes both permission and sovereign ordering of sinful acts, but the moral blame is entirely the creature's. So God wills to permit sin, to direct it towards his holy ends. And if you read the divines on this, like Turretin, he brings out the biblical examples of why we're making this distinction. He points to Genesis 50. He points to the book of Acts. He points to Isaiah. He points to the Assyrians. He points to all sorts of places to show why it is that we're trying to make this distinction. And so I just think it's important for people to understand that, because they rightly raise the point that we have to deal with these examples and have answers. And these distinctions are being made because of those biblical examples, not simply as some sort of like scholastic sounding bloviation to try and sound smart and pious, but to try and actually faithfully deal with the text. And one thing I actually appreciate about the Reformed scholastics, and then I'll give it to you, Oz, is that they don't just posit distinctions for the sake of complexity, but because, again, like I said, they're trying to deal with the biblical examples. And so on this case, the confession, that's why it says, Oz pointed out earlier, that it kind of alludes to this idea of like, are we contradicting ourselves? And it's just walking a very tight line, and it's making a clear delineation, and they give their biblical reasons for why they're saying we have to make this delineation and deal with these texts. So there's a lot of confusion on this because they want to know what do we mean by ordain? What is being meant by ordain? And a lot of people just plug something into that from their own mind, and they think that's now what the confession is aligning with, when it actually could be what they're thinking and understanding isn't actually the way that word is being used. So that's why it's good to look at their biblical examples for why they're saying we're making this distinction, we're using this word, here's why, verse or landmark in scripture, and they just work through like all these varying texts to support whatever that is. So
yeah, and for I'm gonna plug my channel real quick if you guys don't mind. I have some videos specifically on. I did one recently on that chapter 3.1 in the Westminster Confession of Faith about God being not being the author of sin, but ordaining all that comes to pass. And I go through a bunch of primary Reformed sources on how they understood that, and I think you guys would find that helpful if you go to my channel. And also, I did one with Tony Byrne on reprobation, where I can go in more depth because I don't want to bog it down with a lot of content, because I could. I mean, that whole topic is so misunderstood. But I just want to read this from the conclusions of the Canons of Dort. Well, first I'll preface it with this: the anti-Calvinists sometimes rightly has a critique that their critique is right. If their critique is that the Reformed believe that God unconditionally has damned a large group of men out of his sole pleasure, like, then that is problematic. Unconditionally damning anyone, but luckily the conclusions of Dort condemn this view. It says that the same doctrine that teaches that God, by a mere arbitrary act of his will, without the least respect or view to any sin, has predestined the greatest part of the world to eternal damnation, and has created them for this very purpose, that in the same manner in which the election is the fountain and the cause of faith and good works, reprobation is the cause of unbelief and impiety, many other things of the same kind, which the Reformed churches not only do not acknowledge, but even detest with their whole soul. So we too reject that view that God has, without the least respect or view to any sin, has predestined the greatest part of the world to eternal damnation and has created them for that very purpose. We find that view to be blasphemous, and we totally reject it, especially the view too that God is causing unbelief and sin in anyone. So that's rejected. And the question is then, well, if you guys interpret Romans 9 to be about salvation and damnation, then how does it not logically follow? If election is unconditional, then wouldn't damnation be unconditional as well? And I think that's a good question. And I think this is where I see a lot of people mess up, and it's easy to mess up. When you read Davenant's work on animate versions, and again, Davenant is one of the delegates at Dort, and William Cunningham, who's a high Calvinist, actually praised his work as one of the best works he's read on predestination and reprobation. In his book Animate Versions, where he's responding to an Arminian, he talks about how election it's very nuanced. So the way that you get most like the common. Sorry, I'm like trying to think. The common way that people explain predestination and reprobation is God unconditionally elects and although sorry, not the Calvinist, the non-Calvinist, the anti-Calvinist, is God unconditionally elects all men or elects some men and unconditionally damns some men. And then the common like tulip bro will say that no, God unconditionally elects and conditionally they might not say that, but I hope they do. He conditionally damns men or unconditionally reprobates more so. They probably won't even talk about damnation. Unconditional election, unconditional reprobation. Reprobation meaning God passes over in election. So so he elects some to salvation and reprobates some to damnation. But this is where it can get kind of complicated. And I bring it up because it's very important. So Romans 9 is the way that it should be interpreted is God's election unto faith, right? And God's unconditional election unto faith, and God's unconditional reprobation is unconditional reprobation. So that meaning he chooses to not grant the gift of faith to some people. Am I tracking? Are you guys tracking? I mean,
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So God unconditionally chooses to give the gift of faith to the elect, and by that same choice, he's obviously choosing not to give the gift of faith to some, right? So it's more precise than just unconditional salvation. It's unconditional election unto faith. And the reprobation is obviously unconditional as well, right? Because if the election is unconditional, then the reprobation is unconditional. But damnation is conditioned upon sin. But when we were talking about Romans 9, the focus is on election, not damnation, and it's election unto faith. So I know that could get kind of confusing. I just wanted to clarify that a little bit because I think that the proper response that they would give is if you're viewing election unto salvation as unconditional, then how is damnation conditional? Wouldn't it also be unconditional? And the answer is that if you're looking at it that way as unconditional salvation and conditional damnation, yes, there is a contradiction. But more precisely, the Reformed are saying that God unconditionally elects unto faith and unconditionally reprobates. And then we would also say that salvation is conditional and damnation is also conditional, and salvation being conditioned upon faith, but that's the faith that God works in the elect so that they can be saved. So that sounds very confusing. I'm sorry. I tried not to, but I just thought it was important.
That was good.
Yeah, but the key there is that the issue that people typically have is the reprobation side of that aspect. Some people are against like unconditional election, obviously, but typically the objections are often raised around the reprobation aspect of it.
Right.
And it's just important to understand, like you said, that's what I was saying about it's not arbitrary hate. It is always in light of, Oz said it, the condition is their sin. So it's in light of their sin, they are passed over, and basically justice is given. And so the question has to be, or come down to what is the standard of fair? What is the standard of justice, et cetera? So then you kind of have to get into that discussion. But basically it isn't just arbitrary hatred. Like, I kind of see some people talk about it as though it's like before anything, if we're going to speak in human terms, because we're finite, but it's like before anything, God was like, I'm going to create this person for this, and then this person, like this very like rigid sort of like mechanical sort of like, and then brings it about. And then, like I said, it's just this pre-programmed sort of thing. I've tried to talk with as many people as I can who do not like Reformed theology. And anymore, I'm not really interested in the arguing. I got that out of my system like a decade ago. Anymore, I'm more so just interested in trying to see where it is that they're getting these ideas from. Now, yeah, there's people out there and like they can point to someone like that, but I try to dig deeper than that into like, what are you practically thinking that I believe? What I want to hear, like your understanding of what it is that you think that I think. And that's the sort of thing I often get from people is it seems to be that they have this understanding of like a very mechanical, rigid, and it does always tend to come down to the reprobated damnation component. Where they just see it as this like arbitrary hatred of God missing that it's actually upon the condition of their sin, and that mercy by very definition is not something that is, it's like the opposite of something that's earned, or like the opposite of something that is like merited or favored or anything. So you can't really demand that God give mercy. So anyways, just to tack onto that.
And I just wanted to just briefly, I have a quote, but also one of the issues they also have is that it would seem to imply that you guys believe that that some men are created only to be damned. Like that's their end. And I have this quote from John Davenant that hopefully people find helpful. So God creates in time those whom he did not from eternity predestine to blessedness, those whom he foresaw would by their own fault fall into eternal misery, those whom he decreed to permit to fall into this misery. Yet in the meantime, the creation of these men, which in the order of the decree precedes all things, had its own proper end, the glory of God and the diffusion and communication of good, not their damnation, which must be regarded as a consequent event following the creation of the reprobate, not as the intended purpose of the Creator. All that's saying is that no man is created as being fitted to damnation. Every man is created as a capable and fitted subject for salvation. But as a consequence of sin, God has ordained the damnation of those who have sinned, as we've already kind of...
Yeah. They meet the conditions for damnation.
Right. And now that they would, now the anti-Calvinists, I can already hear them. Well, but didn't God decree for them to be sinners? And so they're sinning. And
that gets into needing to properly understand, because when people talk about the decree of God, again, this is another area where you just have to understand, you can't always flatten everything out. I understand that, like, not everybody's a theologian, but just because not everybody's a theologian doesn't mean that every theological subject is just a cakewalk. It's just the reality of how it is. Like, not all subjects are created equal.
That's a good quote. Yeah.
And so like this is one of those areas where, like, I'm sorry, it's just not a soundbite issue. We're talking about something very complex here. So let's not balk and scoff at the fact that it's not me trying to evade or me trying to do some slick, obfuscation. No, it's the fact that we're talking about something very complex. When we're talking about complex things, we have to use complex terminology to try and adequately address what it is we're talking about. And so the nature of God's decree is multifaceted. Oz and I were talking about this earlier, that, like, a lot of people have the understanding of God's decree, again, just from my own experience of engaging with people, listening, seeing the claims, etc. They have a very an understanding of this that's very like it just, well, I lost my train of thought.
Like God's the first, like God pushes a domino and all the other.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect example of like that, almost like a quasi-deist sort of understanding, but also too just like a very God saying, "Let there be light," bang, there it is. That's how every single thing that comes to pass is how it comes to pass. Everything is a direct cause, directly like that. And that's just not the case. That's not the way that everything comes about in terms of when we talk about God's decree. There are distinctions there, which is why we'll bring up things like secondary causation and primary causation, etc. Because we have to distinguish between, we have examples of God directly, again, let there be light, bang, there it is. But not everything that comes about, like sinful things, that comes about by God's permission. Yet that's still a part of and under the genus of the decree of God. Right. So like we have to be way more specific when we talk. We can't just, a lot of these discussions, there's a lot of sloganeering and grandstanding. So I just say that to say, when they bring up, but didn't God decree this? Well, it just shows you have a fundamental misunderstanding of that theological point, because that's a very multifaceted thing that encompasses a lot of things. It's not just like the decree of God and it just is this thing. That's actually like a genus with a number of species underneath it.
Yeah. And I think one of the most recent video I did was on Louis LeBlanc's view. It's same. There's other people that hold to it, Baxter, Gomarus, on God's foreknowledge and stuff, that I think people should check out. Cause I think I think that train of thought, that school of thought, helps answer a lot of the questions people have on the decree. And I think it does a good job at making God sovereign and also giving people free will. However you want to parse that stuff out, I think people might enjoy that. But yeah, I agree that people need to be more careful, especially with this topic. The decree to permit language, I think I find helpful because God doesn't just decree sin as in like commanding it or calling it into existence. He foreknew sin and decreed to permit it. And I know it can get kind of complicated depending on, because there's a little bit of, like I said, I brought up Louis LeBlanc. There's a diversity of thought there. I think Louis LeBlanc's camp does a better job answering this than someone like a Turretin, who views God's knowledge only, like God's counterfactual knowledge is only based on God's decree, whereas Louis LeBlanc has, without adopting middle knowledge, he has a knowledge of counterfactuals in his prior to his decree. But I know that gets too complicated. I don't want to bog it down with those type of complexities.
Well, it's also good to know about like proximate cause versus like primary causation. That's kind of what I was getting at a little bit earlier, but those are like the technical terms of like, think about it this way. Like I always try to think, what are like practical ways that I can, obviously an analogy breaks down at some point. It's not like always exhaustive, but like, what are ways that I can like practically try to explain this to a person who's like struggling with it? And it just like, if somebody's going to go out and commit a murder, and we believe that God is all knowing, you have to then get into the complexities, if you want to get technical, that Oz was getting into about God's knowledge, but just keeping it at the simple level. If God knows about this individual that's going to go and commit murder, this sort of action, there is still the reality that God is the one upholding the universe in which the sinner exists to even be able to commit the action. So by virtue of God upholding the creation that the sinner exists in, you could say that that is nestled underneath causation. But oftentimes people don't think about it that way. When they think causation, they think like force, made to do it. Like that there's like a gun to their back, or that it's just like, again, it's like pre-programmed in a machine and people are just like going through and God is just pulling all these strings. But that's not what we're talking about when we talk about causation. Related to God's permission and permitting it to happen is part of the fact that God is the one upholding the universe and the creation that's keeping the heart beating of the person that's going to go do this action. The universe itself isn't just imploding in on itself before this person does this to stop them from doing it. God is simply permitting and allowing such to occur. And we don't always know the reason why he allows such a thing to occur. So we have to rely on what he has revealed, and trust that he's good and he knows obviously better than we do in our finite understandings. But at the end of the day, that's really what we're getting at when we talk about God's, if you want to use the word involvement, it's not this sort of cause of like forcing to do it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people get confused there because it's not just a reform, by the way, but we talk about God being the first cause of all things, or the primary causality, as you were mentioning, and that's it. He's sustaining you in your actions. Without him, apart from God, we can't move, we can't do anything, we can't. So with God being the first cause as our sustainer, which is all we're saying, is essentially all we're saying, because he's not choosing for you and acting for you. He's enabling your actions. Think of him as the source of the best way I can describe it is just in Acts 17:28. In him we live, we move, and have our being. So that's what we mean by God being the first cause. What we don't mean is God the first cause as in he's the guy who hits the domino and then all the other dominoes fall, or he's not like the gun and the bullet's the secondary cause. The bullet killed the guy, not the gun. So hopefully that helps.
So what do you guys think is like at the heart? It sounds like there's a lot of misunderstandings and overstatements and misstatements, but what do you think is at the heart of Reformed perspective versus the Arminian perspective? And I think part of this is it's overstated. Like you guys said, the Reformed tradition is broad, and so I think when we think of just Arminianism versus Calvinism, it does have some limiting ideas of what the Reformed tradition is. But what do you guys think is at the heart of those perspectives and their differences?
Oh man. Well, we could obviously spend the entire discussion on just this point, depending on how deep we wanted to go. And I know some may be frustrated that we won't be able to exhaust everything, but I've got a few here. A lot of the popular level discussion on this stuff focuses on the soteriological differences and doctrines which touch upon that, such as man's will. However, there's actually a lot more than soteriological differences that many may not be clued in on. The main difference usually surround, conditional versus unconditional election, universal or particular atonement, but with an asterisk, as Oz and I are hypothetical universalists, resistible versus irresistible grace, and then obviously conditional perseverance versus, perseverance. But the two models also propose different answers to theodicy, or the problem of evil, as well as suffering and God's relationship to his creation. They also have different anthropologies, doctrines around humanity in a number of areas. Like Lutherans, the Reformed affirm all of man's being is touched by sin, such that man is formally dead in it, which is why God must first work the miracle of regeneration within them. The Arminian theology tends to see mankind as corrupted, but enabled by prevenient grace to respond to the call of the gospel without that first move, if you will. And we could spend hours on any given one of those areas. But I think the reason the disputes over this stuff matter is actually ultimately the practical ramifications of the theology. I talk about this a lot. I like, talking about this stuff, but I also like to not forget about the average person out there, that the average person out there needs like real practicality. So while not all Christians are expected to be seasoned theologians, they are expected to submit to the word of God and follow the voice of the shepherd. And that includes the under shepherd that you sit under. And if he's worth his salt, he is tasked with feeding you on both word and sacrament as God's instrument. Basically, he is not to border on like Roman Catholicism and like a sacerdotal office, but he is standing in the place of Christ at the sacred desk, if you will. Well, part of that includes practically applying the Bible such that it is applicable in the life of the congregant. And these two different frameworks will impact that. And I don't think a lot of people think about it on that level. They think a lot of times about the theological blood sports, the online banter and the back and forth and dunking on each other and the memes, and all that stuff is fun. But the practicality of it really needs to be examined more. Like I said, while every Christian's not expected to be a theologian, they are expected to live the faith out. And what one believes about these issues does impact how one does that. It impacts the way one grieves, the way one responds and answers to current cultural issues, the way one counsels a marriage, and so on. So I think the practical level reasons are one of the strongest reasons why these disputes matter, why they mattered back then and why they still matter today. Because whether you're a theologian or not, it's going to have trickle-down effects in your own life practically and the way you see the faith. And that can go either way. The really abusive hyper-Calvinist sort of understanding out there, I understand the repulsion. I share that with you. I will stand alongside the person that is repulsed by hyper-Calvinism as a gross, disgusting, whatever. And I get it. I would be repulsed by that, and living, under that sort of mindset. It doesn't sound very healthy. It doesn't sound very, very good. But I would argue that again is an abuse of the system. And I think that when you see the two terms or the two systems back and forth, they really do impact the way that a person like practically lives. So.
Yeah, no, I think I don't think I have any other comments. I think that's better than anything I would say. I would just think I'd be thinking theologically, but practically, yeah, that's a good point.
You guys mentioned this a little bit earlier on, and I'm interested in, if we don't have to spend much time here because it might be out in my My brain, I told you guys, I just come up with stuff on the fly. You guys mentioned John Edwards being a figure of potential deviation of that influence of that particularist perspective, and that idea of the free will being a little bit more rigid. I think the perception right now is that that's certainly the majority of the Reformed perspective. I could be wrong, but it seems like to be the majority now. Was that a deviation? Was that a change? Why did that occur? Is that in response to Arminianism and its spread? You know, is it a reaction to that, or I don't know? Like you guys, I think Oz, you mentioned it was what did you say? I don't know, some level of deviation from the confession, but I don't know. Riff off that a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's an article by Richard Muller. I'll see if I can find it as I'm talking. But
yeah, Calvin Journal.
Yeah, it's Richard. I think it's called like you guys could probably Google it. It's called like Richard Muller and the Parting of Ways, Reformed Orthodoxy. Jonathan Edwards Parting of Ways of Reformed Orthodoxy. So why did it happen? I think Edwards, if I remember correctly, like it seemed like Edwards was trying to adopt like a more, I guess, contemporary, what's the word? Philosophical framework, I guess, to not like just to keep it simple. I don't know. I don't think it was reactionary to Arminians or anything like that. It's just the way that he, the way that his faculty, his psychology, not psychology. Why am I saying psychology? His philosophy. Did I say psychology earlier? I meant to say philosophy. His philosophical framework was just moving away from how the early moderns their terminology, and for whatever reason, people just gravitated towards Edwards. I think he was such a popular figure that I just assume. I don't know the full history, so I don't want to speak on exactly why, but I'm just assuming that because he was such a big figure in the Reformed tradition, people just kind of started adopting his view. But I don't think it would have to do with a reaction to Arminians. I don't know if Miles has anything on that specific.
No, I don't believe it is. Mueller talks about that. I don't want to speak on that, like you were saying, in a bunch of details, because I'm a little bit rough on that just off the cuff. Though I do know that Edwards had a very active evangelistic influence. It wasn't just popular, but he actually had a strong evangelistic influence, and so that included also a lot of literature. And so his view, despite whatever the backstory is to how it got to where it was, the lore, if you will, that had to have 100% played a huge impact, because the circulation of media just at the time of his life was like, that was the cream of the crop. It's like the equivalent of social media today. Like he had access to, very clearly he had access, or somebody did in his circles, to be able to really help circulate the information. So I think that played a really big, like a really big role, just like any of the media at that time theologically. Because you find the same thing with like other groups as well at that time, who were using these same sort of thing, pamphlets, these sort of thing, think of Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. I mean, you can go up to a lot of secular people and they're going to be able to say, oh yeah, I've heard of that. Because it was just such an impactful thing. Well, that was because the media at the time, if you had access to that, that was like having access to cable access, cable TV, being have a cable station to blast out to, however many people in that day. So I think that played a big role as well regarding at least the influence and the spread of it, not necessarily the lore behind it.
Yeah, I found it's called Jonathan Edwards and the Absence of Free Choice, a Parting Ways in the Reformed Tradition. If you guys are interested in reading that for a better summary of that. But yeah. What was the other part of the question?
I don't remember. I think you guys answered it pretty well. I will transition us to, and we've hit on this a little bit, but is Reformed theology, is Calvinism too intellectual? Does it rely too heavily on logical deductions? Does it forsake some of the mysteries of the faith that maybe some other traditions expand upon or are more comfortable with, and kind of rely more on explanatory systems?
This is a really good question, and it's one I'll give my honest take on. It isn't necessarily popular, but it is my honest take from experience. I don't think Reformed theology is too intellectual, but I do think some of the individuals that profess to align with it think they're a lot more intellectual than they are. Because Reformed theology as a rubric or like a theological map has no personality. It's abstract at that level. It's the people that pick up the map and then begin wielding it who give it its voice. And unfortunately, the megaphone has oftentimes ended up in the hands of cage stage types or those seeking to feel intellectually superior, which leaves the impression in the marketplace of ideas that Reformed theology is this sort of cold, callous, arrogant way, of thinking. I'm not one of these types that thinks all Christians have to be a theologian, or that if they don't ascend to like a certain intellectual rigor, their soul is like in jeopardy. But I do think when we're discussing arguably the deepest aspects of reality and existence, that intellectual rigor and logic come with the territory. It's like I'm reminded of the historic arguments between the Lutherans and the Reformed, and the charge of the Reformed being, slaves to the whore of reason. And while I don't necessarily agree with all of what it was often, ported into that charge, I do sympathize with it. At the same time, however, I'm reminded of the Reformed doctrine of the Eucharist, which is like dripping with mystery that even our divines like Vermigli and James Ussher recognize has its limits and should be attributed to mystery. And like, I think oftentimes a lot of those things kind of get looked over. And I don't mean mystery too. I don't want to sidetrack us on that whole excursion, but that's just one area that like immediately comes to mind where you can like be reading these guys and they'll just be like, yep. And we just kind of don't know. And we're just going to leave it there. Like at a certain point, there's some areas where you don't really hear them, try and do that. And they just continue prodding, etc. So all of that to say, I don't think mystery is just like, completely foreign to the tradition, if you will, especially too, if you read some, I have my Puritan paperbacks up on the wall over here. And if you just read some of them on like prayer, and you start to understand, there's almost like some of these guys, you'll read them and there's almost like a mystical aspect to prayer. Like Secret Key to, this book right here. This Thomas Brooks, The Secret Key to Heaven. I mean, very, very mystical. And you don't hear a lot. That's not the stuff that's really popular. That's not the stuff that's going to make you look really fancy and be able to engage in the blood sports and stuff. But if you actually care practically about seeing all that our theologians have to say on every topic, which the Bible has tons to say on prayer and personal piety, if you dig into those sources, you're going to see all sorts of mystery. Read Thomas Watson's little book on
the mystery of the Lord's Supper.
Yeah, the Lord's Supper. I mean, it just... There's a lot there. It's just not the popular stuff. The popular stuff is where you get into all of the the logical order of God's decrees, the Ordo Salutis, soteriology. It's all these things where you do have to engage in a lot of logic and rhetoric and those sorts of things. So on the one hand, I do think there's some context in which us Reformed theology nerd types could dial things back and like not always jump straight into, Socratic methodology and rhetoric in any given discussion. It's like Jeremy from like the non-denominational churches, like at the bonfire. You don't just hit him with like, so you infralapsarian or supralapsarian. Do you believe in physical pre-motion? We can kind of like maybe step it back a little bit and not just always. I know that there's some types out there that do that sort of thing. But at the same time, I also think the attempt to understand God and glorify him with our minds by seeking to understand him and his revelation more deeply should be commended, because this is a huge part of the Reformed heritage. So, I think it's like there's kind of like two hands there, and I sympathize in both directions.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. It really just depends on what topic, and the one that stood out to me is the Eucharist. I feel like there's a lot of mystery there. But then you get into topics, like we were talking about earlier, it can be very intellectual. But I don't think that's exclusive to the Reformed, because the Arminians, the Lutherans, the Thomists, the Jesuits, they all get very, philosophical and intellectual. So, is that a bad thing? I don't think so. It can be, as Miles pointed out, depends on the person. But I do want to say that it's not exclusive to us. Every theological tradition gets on a lot of these issues. You kind of have to. There's some sort of speculation going on, trying to reconcile God's providence over sin. It's gonna be a little complicated. Unless you just want to flatten out scripture and go towards either very Pelagian views or very hyper Calvinist type views. And I don't think either of those are biblical and do justice to the whole counsel of God. So,
well, yeah, and it's like, and I think we need to remember too, like we need to be honest that we're not talking about like baseball here, we're talking about like the actual DNA of reality. We're talking about like the most complex things out there. So it's going to necessitate to some degree, like, that's why I always say, like, I don't think every Christian has to be a theologian. I don't think everyone has to be a scholastic. I don't think everyone is necessarily called to even, engage at that level, because I think that can do more harm than good. I've seen so many people get chewed up by this stuff where they just become so sidetracked that it makes me think of, it's like Paul exhorting the churches to like return to your first love. They get so sidetracked with all the headiness that they start having, all of a sudden their spiritual status is just struggling now. And like they fall into all sorts of things and distractions, and they get so enamored with all this stuff, and it becomes almost like an idol. Like the pursuit of the knowledge almost becomes this idol versus the pursuit of Christ. And so I don't think necessarily everybody's called to that. So, but just to piggyback kind of off of what Oz said there is like, well, yeah, it's like some of this stuff, it's just the nature of what it is. Like some things in life are just complicated. That's just kind of the way it is.
Yeah.
You want to give? I've been throwing a lot out, but
well, Creed had mentioned a little bit at the start of the conversation that you said small C Catholicism, that like universalism and Protestants. Do you guys see? Are there any hyper Calvinists who would say that an Arminian cannot even be saved? Is this like a salvific issue for certain people?
Oh yeah, people like Sonny Hernandez. Yeah, they're out there.
I think it's complicated.
What's your guys' belief on that?
Yeah, I personally don't have it. I don't see Arminians as like unsaved, but I know that it's complicated because some people do, and I don't necessarily think that all people who do are hyper Calvinists. Because I mean, to be fair, like if we look at the Synod of Dort, the way that the Arminians were viewed, they were viewed as basically heretics, So if someone's trying to, I guess, be consistent with that, then
how do you think every person that identifies as quote unquote Arminian is actually a consistent Arminian? Or that they even really understand exactly what it is that the synod was denouncing as heretical? Because I have like a running sort of thing, and this has been my policy for a very long time. I try to always distinguish like people from systems.
Yeah.
And like try
saying they're invincibly ignorant.
No. No. But just like a lot of times, a lot of people you'll talk to, you like get into talking with them and it's like, well, okay, you don't even actually technically align with the thing that it is you're saying you align with. So you're like, blessedly inconsistent, like a blessed inconsistency, basically.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. So do you think most people that are out there that would like embrace saying I'm an Arminian, do you think that they really like understand all that entails? Or do you think that maybe they're saying that oftentimes because they're just trying to distinguish themselves from being a quote unquote Calvinist?
Well, I think there's a lot of people that are like that. Yeah. They kind of think the default if I'm not a Calvinist and I'm an Arminian. But I don't know. It's hard for me to answer that because I don't know if I can say I know what a consistent Arminian is. I don't know I haven't thought it through to see what their view entails necessarily. So I don't feel comfortable answering that. All I'll say is that personally, I don't see an issue with Arminians or even their theology. As what's funny is engaging with provisionists has made me have a newfound appreciation of Arminians.
Yeah, dude.
And I feel bad for the way they've been treated because we didn't know how good we had it with them.
Dude.
So
there's some crazy stuff coming out of that camp.
Yeah, and I think the Arminians a lot of times are unfortunately they've been misrepresented a lot by Calvinists, and I don't know. I don't agree with the Arminians. I just am more sympathetic towards them, and I know I might get critiques from my more reformed brethren, truly reformed ones.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I would much rather take an Arminian than a hyper Calvinist any day. Any day, I would much rather be on their team than with Sonny Hernandez, who if you reject any of the TULIP, 20th century acronym, then you're
not even a Christian.
Yeah,
no, he says you're not even a Christian.
Yeah, you're not
period.
a Christian. You're probably a reprobate. I mean, that kind of behavior is disgusting, and yeah, I don't know.
Clueless. Totally clueless.
Yeah. So yeah.
What's a provisionist? Never heard of that. I'm personally not on any social media.
That's not on me. I've heard of the term, but I don't know them very well.
I got rid of all my social media, so like I'm like in the dark on some of.
I rope Seth into it. So. But yeah, what is that? I've just seen them, and in my head that's like, I don't know. That's people that are going against the Calvinists online, but I don't really know what makes them a provisionist versus
Armenian,
not an Arminian, an Armenian.
Yeah. What's funny is that they'll say is anyone who believes that God has provided, made a provision for all men and loves all men and desires their salvation, things that Calvinists would affirm, So it's very vague, but it
is. Here's how I would describe it, Oz. Now I know they're not going to embrace this. If they watch this, they're going to be like, no, bro. Okay, chill, guys, chill. Okay, I would describe it as just a contra new Calvinist position.
Yeah,
it's contra new Calvinism. That's what it is. Its whole identity is wrapped up in contra later what I would call an adaptation of Reformed theology, based on a true story. Reformed theology, because you know what they do with based on a true story, right? Well, it's based on like true events and true people, but we spice it up with these other details that they're not really there in the history, but they serve really good on film. So it's like it's kind of based on a true story, or like it's kind of true to reality, but it's only like based on these real things. Well, that's what I would consider New Calvinism to be. And provisionism is basically a response to this detestation of that. And it seems like all they talk about is just Calvinism. Their understanding of Calvinism. It's just really, I used to go back and forth with like Leighton Flowers and that crowd years ago, like 7 or 8 years ago. Like I said, I kind of got all that sort of stuff out of my system a while ago. And it's just crazy to see. It's like, man, the Black Binder, he's like still going just on like the same talking points. It's like, holy smokes, dude, it's been like 12 years, but all right. Just like, okay. Just all they talk about is like this weird caricature, which again, to be fair, I understand why they're saying it, but they cherry pick on the same hobby horse individuals and claims. It's just, it's like a very scripted anti-new Calvinist perspective.
Yeah. I met some cool ones, but for the most part, a lot of, I don't know. I just haven't had that many good experiences with a lot of them. I have a lot of them blocked on my Twitter, but yeah they differ from Arminianism, where most of them, there's, because the tent's so big, they have different nuances, but typically they reject original sin,
total depravity,
and an immediate work of grace, or so yeah. So different from the Arminians who affirm total depravity and the necessity of grace for salvation, or to come to
Yeah,
faith.
because like provisionism is like not a tightly wound systematic theology. You're gonna find like open theists that identify with it. They'll like buddy up with it. Yeah, like Pelagians, semi-Pelagians, open theists. It just like anything, it just attracts, in my experience, it just attracts people who just have a disdain for what they understand to be, Calvinism. Man, it just, as long as you detest Calvinism, you're welcome. Basically, like, now I don't think they would embrace obviously like anti-Trinitarians. Maybe they do, I don't know, but they don't have any issue. Yeah, it's like, well, they don't have any issue, embracing other formal heretics. So, wouldn't shock me. But I don't want to saddle all of them with that. I'm just saying that it's a very big tent that basically the only thing that really, really, really unites them is like a very small handful of doctrines, but predominantly, it is their disdain for what they understand to be Calvinism, and they love doing these interviews with people that are like, I left Calvinism. I couldn't do it anymore. That person is just like the prime person to just go and like, at least it used to be. I don't know if they still do that anymore, but back when I was really engaging in that world, they used to like always like do interviews with people that are like, I got saved out of Calvinism, that sort of thing. And that was kind of like the hallmark of their identity.
Yeah. One, just because it ties into like what we're talking about. One of the things, or some of the things that they kind of like, unite in, and they talk about all the time, is God's love for all men, God's desire for the salvation of all men, and God's provision of Christ for all men. And what I find kind of funny about that is that the Reformed historically wouldn't have issues with that, right? We would, so because there is a difference, but they're not pointing out the difference. So God's love for all men. The Reformed, even though this is what they attack. So they attack the Tulip Bro, hyper Calvinists, even some Calvinist popularizers, unfortunately, who they'll say that God doesn't love all men, that He only loves the elect. Yeah. But historically, I'm gonna plug in a channel. There's a freaking giant fly in here. I don't know what it's doing here. Not channel. I'm going to plug this website. And I think for the viewers, check these. If you haven't checked these out, it's called calvinandcalvinism.com and theologicalmeditations.blogspot.com. David Ponter and Tony Byrne have done a great job quote mining Reformed theologians on God's love, God's will of salvation for all men. It's just like so rich in the Puritans and all these Reformed authors, where the Reformed affirm that God loves all men. The difference between the Arminians and the Provisionists is that the Calvinists would say that God doesn't love all men equally, right? God has a special love for the elect. Just like I love my wife, but analogous, not the exact same because we're talking about God here. But I love my wife, but I love my friends, but I don't love my friends in the same way that I love my wife. Analogous as God loves His church, and God loves, the non-elect too. He loves all men, but not in the same type of way. God's will that all men be saved. If you read John Calvin, everyone affirms God's will of salvation of all men. Just doesn't will it equally. For the non-elect, it's on the condition that they repent and believe, and for the elect, He not only wills that wills their salvation on the condition of repentance and faith, but He also works in them to effectually lead them to faith so that they may be saved. And we're hypothetical universalists. So within the Reformed tradition, obviously the Limitarian would take issue with this, and they might be squeamish about the former thing we talked about because it does cause a little bit of tension in their view. But they still, you have guys like John Murray and a bunch of Calvinists who affirm it, and they just affirm it in tension. They know that there's a tension with God's desire for all men to be saved and limited atonement, but they think that they're both taught in Scripture, so they hold to it in tension. But for me and Miles, like, we can affirm that and have no tension. So their other point on God providing Christ for all men, the Reformed who hold to universal satisfaction or hypothetical universalism would affirm that. So yeah, kind of rambled there, but
Yeah, Stephen Charnock, I have his works over there, and his whole like prolegomena is just him basically working out like all this sort of stuff, like first principles regarding like God, and he goes into all this, and it's just like, I know I think about that whenever I see, and again, it's been a minute. Like you, I have a bunch of them blocked because I just, not because of anything personal, I just don't want to see it in my X feed.
yeah.
So I just do that to keep it from popping up. But when I was engaging with all of them, I eventually got to a point where I was starting to be, more introduced to these modern Reformed theologians, or early modern Reformed theologians. And it's like they're all these things that they're objecting to. It's like, well, that's not even actually like, you're not going deep enough on the issue. Like Oz mentioned about the love of God, which is like, well, but we see this in Scripture. We have to look, and I feel like the provisionist reading oftentimes, not to make this all about provisionism here, but I just feel like oftentimes their reading, it just, I don't mean this in like an insulting way. It just like, it's very remedial. It just like struggles. It seems like a lot of them just struggle to see like, well, this is in the Bible though. There's instances where like, if you look at this beyond just this really surface level, and I'm not talking about some like hidden Gnostic spiritual sort of reading. No. I'm talking about using our brains. Like God does expect, it's like why the confession says something doesn't have to be stated verbatim in the Scriptures to be taught. It can also be arrived at through good and necessary consequence, meaning God expects us to use our minds to glorify him. And so we kind of have to like look at things a lot deeper than I feel like their system oftentimes wants to go. And if you go back to these other individuals, you'll see that, but that's not really what they're ever critiquing. It's typically, again, they have like the handful selection of John Calvin quotes that oftentimes they're just not understanding the way, even if you disagree with him, again, you should understand Calvin's vocabulary in light of his own dictionary. And how he's using the terminology. I don't always agree with him, and I don't think he's the best across the board on every subject, but they just have like these, their favorite texts from these individuals. And if it is a Reformed person, a reformer, it's typically like John Calvin, but usually they're going to like R.C. Sproul, or they're going to some modern person where it's like they bid on to where Sproul said, there's not a single atom in all the universe that's not under God's control. And, obviously this is the sort of language that people hear, and that's where they come away with these conclusions of the things that they then latch onto and they start attacking. So again, maybe it's changed. But when I was engaging in that world, it was a lot of the like 20th century, 21st century, even people out there that claim to be Calvinists, not even necessarily Reformed, just Calvinists. John MacArthur. I mean, you're attacking Reformed theology using John MacArthur. Okay. But anyways, that's kind of in a nutshell where the what I would classify provisionism kind of centering around.
All right. Well, I'm gonna roll us down. We've gone for the 90 minutes, and I appreciate you guys coming on and breaking this down. I feel like there's so much more we could cover. So honestly, we'll get there. It is a lot to deep dive. I'll forward resources on provisionism for my brother, so he even knows what that is.
I would just
thank you,
ignore
guys.
it. You're probably better off without it, to be honest.
Yeah. But again, I wanted to thank you guys for coming on and chatting with us. We're going to be diving in more and having more conversations in the future. So I'll again say subscribe to the Obro Show for more conversations like this. We're going to be talking more theology and stuff like that. And then Oz and Miles, anything you guys want to plug, anything you guys are working on that you want to shout out real before we close down?
I'm always working on stuff, but I'm not always working on stuff that people necessarily want to watch. So that's kind of the fun tightrope. I don't buy into like the e-drama sort of blood sports stuff. I'm just not really into that. I don't think it really helps the dialogue. I don't think it helps the discourse. Unfortunately, I know that that tends to be what gets the most clicks. That's what gets the most views. People want to be entertained. They can hardly watch for more than like 2 or 3 minutes without, just crazy, stuff happening to keep them amused. So unfortunately, I don't make stuff like that. But for people who do actually like rigorous wealth, at least I attempt to well think out and plan the pieces and really provide a sort of value. It's not focused exclusively on apologetics, but really just on scripture and tradition, canon and creed, regarding specifically the historic Protestant understanding, again, more broad than just the Reformed tradition. But my video on Wednesday is going to be a first for this channel, the sort of format and the very cinematic storytelling. But we're going to be looking at the book of Jonah and just showing people how engaging with really the skeptic claim of Jonah being this sort of punchline of the Bible, if you will, that it's this sort of silly, goofy story. But actually showing how the next time a person hears that, if you watch this video, you'll actually know how to respond to the individual that says that and share the gospel with that person. So that's one thing that is on the radar out of a number of other things. I also have the first debate that's going to be happening on the channel coming up that I'm really excited about. Going to be breaking the ice on live form content. I'm going to have 2 Roman Catholic apologists and a Lutheran apologist. They're going to be debating if St. Augustine taught purgatory as the Roman Catholic Church has defined it. So should be interesting.
Yeah, that sounds fun.
That's exciting.
Yeah, for me, I don't know when I'll get to it, but I plan on having a buddy on to discuss. So earlier we brought up Richard Muller and the free will discussion. I know that might have gone over a lot of people's heads, and I kind of mumble and bumble here and there, so it's probably hard to catch some of that. But hopefully, I can get a buddy on to discuss that. And so for those that want to learn more through audio, first I recommend reading Muller, but I can have him on and we can discuss that. So keep an eye out for that. And I just want to say, again, if there's so many good sources you can find. If you go to the calvinism.com and theologicalmeditations.blogspot.com. I think if you're interested in Calvinism and understanding it, getting away from like the caricatures and the misrepresentations that non-Calvinists and also quote unquote Calvinists make, check out that blog. It's great. It's got a lot of good sources. You can find a lot of great theologians there. I just want to plug in Stephen Charnock. Check him out. Read his books. He's a great theologian. Honestly, if you have to read between Calvin and basically anyone else, read anyone else than Calvin. Calvin's sometimes not the most helpful, especially in providence and sin. But
he's really good on stuff like this, which a lot of people forget about, like his dialogue with Cardinal Sadaletto, where he talks about like the necessity of the Reformation. Calvin's really good with rhetoric. He's really good at showing like inconsistencies that he points out with like Roman Catholicism or things like that. So those are the sort of things I recommend him on.
Yeah.
But like Oz said, not necessarily, you can't take to the bank every individual just because they're branded like a Reformed theologian. It's good to learn what areas that they like really excelled at and what areas they just had blind spots in, or like things hadn't moved along far enough at a certain point. Like Charnock comes at, generation after Calvin.
Right.
I can't remember what a generation is technically, but the point being is that he's willing to embrace some other things that Calvin didn't, in terms of like clarifiers and qualifications that just makes him better on things like providence, etc.
Yeah, I agree. Or even his contemporary Vermigli has a work on providence.
Oh yeah.
The Reformed traditions just sometimes they're a lot better. The other Reformed theologians than Calvin on some of these things. But anyway, yeah, just wanted to say that, and thank you guys for having us on. That was fun. Hope we could do it again.
Awesome way to end stream. It's an awesome way to end the stream where the clickbait says why to be a Calvinist, and you guys say, hey, maybe start with someone who's not John Calvin. That's an awesome way to end.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you guys. Gonna end the stream, and then we'll figure it out after that. All right.